Toons were one of the earliest monster subtypes to be put in the game, being cartoon versions of other popular monsters which have summoning sickness, but also the ability to attack directly. And in this video, we'll be going over how Konami treated what's arguably the first Yu-Gi-Oh archetype, as well as the impact it had on the game throughout the years. In the first main set released in the West, way back in 2002, the Toon monsters were introduced to the TCG. This initial wave set the tone for the archetype for the rest of the time, being comprised entirely of parodies of other monsters. We got retrains for Blue Eyes White Dragon, Rue Ran, Red Archery Girl, and Summon Skull, as well as the titular Toon world. The monsters all share the same effects, being that they first need to be special summoned from your hand by tributing the amount of monsters they need to be brought out with normal summons. They cannot attack the turn that they're special summoned, and require to pay 500 life points to declare an attack, and can attack your opponent directly unless they control a Toon monster, in which case they must target that for its attacks. And last, if Toon World is destroyed, they get destroyed as well. Despite having such large effects text between each monster, these retrained vanillas were hardly better than their original forms. The only thing they had going for them was being one of the first few ways to special summon monsters from your hand in the game. However, the setup was just too big to ever make it worth it, as you needed both tribute fodder and a specific spell in the field to get them all out, putting it on par with the terrible at the time ritual summons. For all of their restrictions and requirements, all they gave you was a decently sized monster that could attack directly, but only a turn after they were summoned, making them very likely to die to some form of removal before doing anything. To make matters worse, these monsters all die to both monster and spell trap removal, as if the continuous spell gets removed, they go out with it. Toon World didn't help with their viability at all, as despite being a reality warping tool in the anime, it has literally no effects in its real world form, only a 1000 life point cost to be activated. With all that said, this would still be the only card out of the first wave of Toon supports to see play in the following years. However, it sets out a bad precedent for the archetype, when the card that does literally nothing manages to be more useful than the entire monster lineup. A couple of years later, Konami would once again try their hand at making Toon monsters, this time not limiting themselves for vanillas when it came to retrains. In 2005, we got Toonified versions of Cannon Soldier, Goblin Attack Force, Gemini Elf, and Mass Sorcerer. Unlike the first wave of monsters, these have no summon restrictions, allowing them to be normal summoned or special summoned as you wish. They still kept the summoning sickness and the effect to be destroyed when Toon World gets popped, but they didn't need to pay 500 life points to attack anymore. In addition to the ability to attack directly, they also got different monster effects based on their original forms. Toon Cannon Soldier gets to tribute a monster to inflict 500 life points of damage to your opponent. The Goblin Attack Force has a huge 2300 attack stat line on level 4 monster, but gets stuck in defense position for a turn if it attacks. Toon Mass Sorcerer lets you draw a card if it inflicts battle damage to your opponent. And lastly, Toon Gemini Elf, being the only one based on an effectless monster, got an effect that matches Mass Sorcerer's, but making your opponent discard a random card when a damage is dealt instead. This new wave also gave Toon spells and traps with actual effects to be used, like Toon Defense, a continuous trap which can make your opponent attack directly when they target one of your level 4 lower Toon monsters for attacks. Despite this being such a mediocre inclusion to the archetype, it came alongside the main reason Toon cards saw play at all, Toon Table of Contents, which is a normal spell which reads, add one Toon card from your deck to your hand. The fact that this card doesn't exclude itself from the search, letting you add another Table of Contents off of it, gave this card a niche in multiple decks throughout the years. Being able to deck thin and fill the graveyards with 3 spells is something no other card can do. This unique role has made this card a huge staple in many decks centered around Magical Explosion. A normal trap just does 200 damage to your opponent for each spell card in your graveyard. Toon Cannon Soldier saw play in old OTK/FTK decks due to being more easy to find than the regular Cannon Soldier, letting you capitalize off of combos that give you infinite fodder, such as Dark Magician of Chaos looping Dimension Fusion. Toon World would go on to see play in similarly degenerate strategies, but which plan to draw through their whole deck to win instead. Royal Magical Library is a monster which gains a spell counter each time a spell card is activated, and lets you remove 3 spell counters to draw a card. This means a single Toon Table of Contents represents 4 spell counters on Library, as you get your other 2 copies and then activate a Toon World. Since it's a continuous spell, it'll also combo well with other enablers for Library, because Giant Trunade can bounce them all back to your hand to reuse them to get even more counters. The life point cost was actually a bit of an upside since it helped you reach the life point threshold needed to activate some of the win conditions, such as Life Equalizer for Magical Explosion or Reversal Quiz. Toon World would also see a tiny bit of play in very early builds of Magical Musketeers, as all of the monsters in that archetype let you plus in some way when a spell trap card was activated in the same column as themselves. Since the deck used to rely on Ties of the Brethren to flood the field with monsters for a power play, the Table of Contents engine enabled you to activate up to 4 Magical Musketeers effects off of a single card. Toon Table of Contents power was so high, it even allowed Toon Gemini Elf to get itself a few tops to its name in Spellbook decks. The strategy's strongest card, Spellbook of Judgment, gives you an extra add off of a Spellbook spell card for each spell card activated that turn, as well as lets you summon a spellcaster monster from your deck who has a level less than or equal to that number. So, by comboing Judgment with Toon Table of Contents, you get to add 3 spells in Jiaojun the Spiritualist, a really powerful floodgate on your side of the field at the end of the turn. As a bonus, since Toon Gemini Elf is a spellcaster, it can also be used to turn on many of your spellbook cards in a pinch, though hopefully you'd be discarded for hand size at the end of the turn instead of after filling your hand with Spellbook of Judgment. Even Blue Eyes Toon Dragon ended up seeing some play, and that was not due to the Blue Eyes support catapulting the deck into a Worlds of Win at the year. Rather, it was because of Monarch FTK. Its all play there is a great way to thin the deck, while also giving you another trade-in on top of the Monarchs to make it even easier to draw through your whole deck. While many of these cards would go on to see play after release, the Toon archetype itself was forgotten for a really long time. The only other monster the archetype got was Toon Dark Magician Girl shortly after, whose effects makes her gain 300 attack for each Dark Magician or Magician of Black Chaos in the graveyards. However, this card was only notable for being the first Toon monster that did not have Summoning Sickness or a cost to attack. But this is only because, due to the way Konami used to write cards before problem-solving card text was a thing, it would be impossible to also fit those restrictions into the text box back in the day. This did make this card into what was probably the best Toon monster of the time, but it still wasn't nearly good enough to make this strategy worth building around. The archetype's playstyle and win condition only got more outdated by the day, and Toons remained forgotten as anything but as Toon Table of Contents enablers. However, around a decade after Toon Dark Magician Girl was introduced to the game, Konami would try their hand once again at making direct Toon support. Throughout 2015 and 2016, Toons would be revitalized with many new members, be it for monsters or spells and traps. Toon Cyber Dragon, just like Cyber Dragon, is a 2100 attack beater with the ability to be brought out for free as long as your opponent controls a monster and you don't. This would go on to become the most played Toon monster in Yu-Gi-Oh history, for reasons entirely unrelated to the main archetype. Early during the Link era, Konami would release some new batches of Cyber Dragon support. This included Chimera Tech Mega Fleet Dragon, a level 10 fusion monster which can contact fuse using one Cyber Dragon monster and one or more monsters in the extra monster zone, and it can use monsters from either side of the field as its materials. Essentially, this allowed you to use Cyber Dragon's body on the field as a way to remove your opponent's monsters from the extra monster zone. This matched incredibly well with the meta at the time, as the top decks all relied on Link monsters for their strategies, and even if they didn't, due to how Master Rule 4 worked, they would still be putting a monster into the extra monster zone as long as they went into the extra deck at all. Mega Fleet was a big reason why Cyber Dragons were a viable rogue deck for multiple formats, and its power was so great they'd sometimes even run Toon Cyber Dragon as more copies of Cyber Dragon, just to make sure you'd consistently be able to deal with your opponent's board before committing to your normal summon. When it comes to splashing Mega Fleet Dragon in other decks as a going second option, most decks opted to run a playset of regular Cyber Dragon. However, Sky Striker decks would often go for Toon Table of Contents plus Toon Cyber Dragon instead, as they would also let you get 3 spell cards in the graveyard, unlocking the full power of their Sky Striker spells without having to play into the board at all. Toon Cyber Dragon ended up as the most useful Toon monster in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, but while it did have its niche, the amount of play it saw was still just a fraction of regular Cyber Dragons. This was the only card from its wave of support to actually see play, and the last time a Toon card would be consideration for any deck. Around the time it came out, we also got retrains for Ancient Gear Golem, which inflicts piercing battle damage and disables all spells and traps at the end of the damage step, and Buster Blader, which gains 500 attack for each dragon in your opponent's field and in the graveyard. The original versions of these monsters never really saw any play back in the day, and were only reluctantly put on modern versions of the decks due to being required bricks for certain cards, and so did nothing for Toons themselves. Lastly, there was also Toon Barrel Dragon, with its pretty unimpressive effect to target a card in the field and pop it if you throw 2 out of 3 heads, whose only notable trait is that its retrain once wreaked havoc in Duel Links. However, even if these 3 were quite mediocre, the archetype would also go on to receive a plethora of spell and trap card support around the same time. The most important of these cards was Toon Kingdom, the long-awaited retrain for Toon World. This field spell requires you to banish 3 cards to the top of your deck face down on activation. It becomes Toon World while it's on the field, and makes your opponent unable to target Toon monsters you control with card effects. It also lets you protect Toon monsters you control from being destroyed by banishing the top card of your deck face down instead. Toon Kingdom was actually a very strong card for the time. It essentially made your whole field unable to be targeted or destroyed by card effects, a kind of protection which is decent even in today's metagame. This card let dedicated Toon strategies stop running the effectless Toon World, and while it didn't fix pretty much all the Toon monsters so far being effectless vanillas, it at least made them hard to remove. Some of this support was mediocre, like Toon Shadow and Toon Rollback being bad OTK enablers, or Toon Briefcase not being much better than a bottomless trap hole most of the time, but there were also some cards with powerful effects enough to match Toon Kingdom. Comic Hand is a snatch steal as long as you control Toon World. Mimicat can either steal a spell trap from your opponent's graveyard or be a monster reborn under similar conditions, and Toon Mask lets you special summon a Toon from your deck with a level equal to or lower than your opponent's monster. While these are all powerful effects on their own, it still didn't help form a cohesive strategy for the archetype. Mimicat and Comicat are the best of them because being potentially able to use a card from your opponent's deck is probably going to be better than any card or Toon deck would be running. Unfortunately, Konami also decided to make these cards unsearchable at the time, as they lacked Toon in their name. On the sets that followed this latest wave, a couple more members would be added to the strategy still. Red Eye's Toon Dragon came shortly after, with the same usual Toon restrictions and the ability to once per turn special summon any Toon monster from your hand, ignoring its summon conditions. Afterwards, there was Toon Dark Magician, which lets you discard one Toon card to either add a Toon spell trap from your deck to your hand, or special summon a Toon from your deck, ignoring its summoning conditions. Despite having received some cards which would turn any other archetype into a meta threat, Toons remained a strategy too weak to even be rogue. Toon Kingdom was a good card, especially since Terraform was still at 3 at this time, but you needed this card to stick around in your field for your strategy to be even slightly annoying. And around the same time, we had Mystical Space Typhoon being run at 3 of as a staple in almost every deck. Dark Magician Red Eyes had some pretty good effects, but they were still both level 7 monsters with no inherent special summon condition, and an archetype with no good way to get them out. Even with over 20 Toon cards being in the game now, the strategy still had almost nothing when it came to disruption or advantage generation. While there might have been some hope that future support could elevate Toons into a real strategy before, like it happened with the Blue Eyes and Harpies, it was entirely gone by now. At last, in the same year where Master Rule 4 revisions dropped, Konami would drop the last wave of support for this archetype. This set, appropriately called Toon Chaos, even had Toon Blackluster Soldier as its cover card. Toon BLS is a level 8 Earth Warrior monster with 3000 attack, and it must first be special summoned by attributing Toon monsters from your hand or field whose total levels equals 8 or more. If you control Toon World, not only can it attack directly, but it also lets you target and banish a card on the field, but it cannot attack the turn it activates its effect. Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning, the card which this was based on, ravaged the metagame for many years and was even banned at some point. With all that said, it had long been phased away from the metagame by this time its Toon version dropped. While it finally gives the archetype a decent form of removal, as well as a good monster without summoning sickness, its ritual-like conditions means you will either need to cheat it out with other Toon support, or go heavily minus to bring it out from the hand. The other monster was Toon Harpy Lady. It has the usual Toon effects, but can special summon itself for free as long as you control Toon World, and then if you control another Toon monster, you can pop a card on the field. Despite being way too mediocre for 2020 standards, Toon Harpy Lady is still one of the better monsters of the archetype, if only due to being a free extender from the hand. It took almost 20 years, but the archetype finally got another one after Toon Mermaid way back then. For the spells, there's Toon Bookmark. This is the normal spell which lets you add either Toon World or any card that's specifically listed in its card text from your deck to your hand. Also, it can, more importantly, banish itself from the graveyard to protect Toon World you control from being destroyed. More consistency was always welcome, but its protection was great for an archetype that lives and dies by its field spell. Its search effect is only once per turn, unlike Toon Table of Contents, but it's a wider search pool since it checks for Toon World in the effects text, so it lets it be much more versatile in what is allowed to search out from the archetype. Then there's Toon Page Flip, a quick play spell which lets you, if you control Toon World, reveal 3 Toons of different names from your deck, then your opponent picks one of them to special summon at random, ignoring its summoning conditions. Then the rest are shuffled back into the deck. It's a shame that the best starter and extender for the archetype is still giving you just a 1 in 3 chance of getting the monster you want on the field, but that's still much better than the archetype could hope for otherwise. At least with Toon BLS, there are actually 3 pretty good reveals for this card, even if you can't rely on getting anything specific out of it. And last, there's Toon Terror, a counter trap which can negate and destroy a spell, trap, or monster as long as you control both Toon World and a Toon monster. A counter trap Omni-Negate may have once been a telltale sign of a great archetype, but it's not nearly enough to carry a deck by itself during the modern era. A good interaction during your opponent's turn has been something Toon decks have missed since their inception. But not only is it worse than just many other archetypal counter traps, it's not even guaranteed to be on when you draw into it due to how inconsistent Toons are. With this being the last wave of support, this is how Toon monsters stand these days. Despite being a fan favorite strategy due to its anime relevance, it was never able to stand on its own as a standalone deck. Toon Cyber Dragon, the last other monster to see competitive play, hasn't been put into a competitive deck in multiple years now. And that's unlikely to change in the future due to the new Master Rule being a thing. Even with so many ways of support, Toons are still a much worse strategy than many other predominantly casual archetypes, such as Dark Magicians. While Blackluster Soldier and Toon Terror did give some slightly threatening tools for them to use, it still wouldn't be enough to make them playable in 2015, and much less now. It still isn't the easiest thing in the world to field out Toon monsters, and even if it was, you still wouldn't be able to leverage all the bodies into an OTK due to their summoning sickness. The core design tenets of Toons are just at complete odds with how the modern game has developed, making sure they will never have a place in the metagame as long as they stick to them. Even in Duel Links, where their skills that put Toon World on the field for free, Toons have had much limited success as a full-fledged strategy. with this skill mostly seen play in spellcaster decks, only using Toon Dark Magician Girl as an OTK enabler. With no more ways of support on the horizon, it is likely this decades-old archetype with so many great artworks to its name will remain completely irrelevant until the end of time. It's hard to say what kind of Toon support is needed for these cards to see any play now, as the deck fails to compete both as a control or OTK strategy. Be it through broken extra deck support or some crazy new Toon World retrain, it would take a lot to shape this aimless group of cards into an actual strategy. Alright, and that's the video. If you can think of any good ways for Toons to be fixed, or know of any other cards you'd like to see covered, please let us know down in the comments below.